So let us look at what we call the levels of biological organization. So why do we want to look at it, and why? What is it actually? Just as an introduction, it's very important that you know that in biology we deal with the study of living organisms. But if we are going to look at these living organisms, we need to know at what level can we look at them. Okay, because can we look at them as in terms of what makes them up? If we are going to look at what makes these organisms up, then it means that we need to look at the details. So those details occur at what levels? That's why it is very important to look at these biological levels of organization, or you can call them levels of biological organization. Sometimes it can be called levels of organization in biology. Okay, so that is what basically it means briefly. But for us to understand it deeper, perhaps we can start with a scenario. And that scenario looks at a mold. In a mold, you have termites. Okay, so these termites are actually organized in such a way that you have different types that are actually carrying out different roles. You actually also have the queen, for example, carrying out a particular role. Okay, so that means that you have very many termites that carrying out different roles. That means that there's some level of organization there. But also when you look at these termites individually, each termite, you will find out that there are different cells that may actually make up these termites. So that means that these cells actually also have to work together to accomplish particular functions. Okay, so that means that there are some levels of organization that you have in, for example, termites in a mold. And therefore, looking at this scenario, we should be able to relate it with biological levels of organization. So the scenario goes as follows. Wildlife biologists observe a large termite mold. Inside the mold, they find thousands of individual termites working together to maintain the structure and care for the queen and forage for food. Termites themselves are composed of cells, including specialized cells for digestion and communication. These cells contain numerous organelles like mitochondria for energy production. The termites are also interacting with other living organisms such as grasses they consume and predators. Okay, so the questions are identify and describe at least the 3 different levels of biological organization present in this scenario, and then 2, explain how the interaction between the organisms at one level contributes to the functioning of a higher level. Okay, so this scenario will be actually good in us understanding what biological levels of organization are. So you can have, for example, a forest. That forest is made up of different species. You have large trees, you have shrubs, you have grass, you have even microscopic organisms that you cannot actually see using your naked eye. So that means that you have very complex organisms like the huge plants or the huge trees, and then you have very, very, very tiny organisms that you cannot actually see with your naked eye. For example, in the forest that you see in the picture. Okay, so that means that for us to understand these biological organisms, we need to look at them following a particular hierarchy. We can move from the simplest level to the more complex level. So these levels are the ones that we are calling the hierarchies. Okay, we're looking at the smallest organism that can actually be made up of one cell, and then look at the very complex organisms that are made up of several cells. But we also can look at several of these organisms that are made up of several cells interacting as a community. You have, for example, organisms of the same species or even different species being in the same area at the same time. Okay, so that means that these are the ones that we call levels, and they help us in understanding these living organisms. So what we are basically saying that each level is actually different from the other. For example, if we look at the microorganism, when it is in individual, that means if you, for example, look at a butterfly individually, the way what makes up this butterfly is different from, for example, the cells that actually make up this butterfly. So that means that we can look at organisms as blocks, such that you move from the small blocks to bigger blocks, okay, or to larger blocks, and that will now give us a better understanding of what happens. For example, in a forest where you have very many organisms, so you start from lower levels of organization to very complex levels of organization, such as what you see in a forest or even in a water body. Okay, so let's go further. The lowest level that you can start at when looking at microorganisms, basically, or living things, is the chemical level. What chemicals or compounds or atoms or elements make up an organism? Okay, that's the lowest level that you can start with. So when we're looking at chemical level, within the chemical level, we start with understanding the nature of atoms. Okay, because we know that every matter, we know what matter is, that anything that occupies space and has weight, right? That is matter. Now, every matter has, or matter consists of atoms. Okay, what is the structure of the atom? So in our image, the first image that you can see, it is basically to depict what an atom is. An atom, we are saying, is the smallest unit of an element. Okay, that's what we are saying. Atoms of the same element usually are the same. They are the same. What distinguishes atoms of one element from the other, it's about what we call subatomic particles, and those are the ones that I'm going to emphasize here. So an atom has a nucleus. The nucleus is usually in the center of that atom. In the nucleus, we have subatomic particles that we call nucleons. The nucleons consist of protons and neutrons. So inside the nucleus of an atom, you have particles that we call protons and neutrons. And then outside the nucleus of an atom, you have what we call shells. These shells, you'll find electrons. These electrons keep moving around the nucleus along the shells. We often say these atoms do orbit around the nucleus. Okay, so an atom consists of the nucleus, where we have the subatomic particles, the protons and the neutrons, and then we also have electrons. So those are the things that make up an atom. So that means that if we are looking at anything that we can touch, or even any stuff around us that is matter, we can look at the atoms that make that matter, right? So the basic level of organization, or the smallest unit you can start with, is an atom. So an atom, by definition, is the smallest unit of an element. Okay? So, for example, we can take an example of, for example, water. Water is made up of two types of atoms, oxygen and hydrogen. And we actually write water as H2O. And this is what you basically see here. This is the water molecule. That is how it looks like. So H2O, that is water. So water molecule has hydrogen and oxygen. For each atom of oxygen, there are two hydrogen atoms. That is the nature of the water molecule. Now, this hydrogen and this oxygen are connected together through what we call chemical bonds. So this is to say that atoms of the same element are the same. Atoms of the same element. If we have different elements, and we have elements that have many atoms, we have elements that are diatomic, triatomic, meaning that you have 3 or 2 atoms in that element. Okay, so these atoms are connected by bonds, and that is what we are emphasizing there. So we have elements that actually exist as molecules. So nitrogen, oxygen, these are molecular elements. Okay, so they exist as molecules that consist of atoms. So oxygen, we write it as O2. Okay, we write oxygen as O2. So meaning that one molecule of oxygen consists of 2 atoms of oxygen. Okay, so oxygen is a molecular element. We also have other molecular elements that we can talk about. Is to say that, for example, water is a molecular compound. Okay, water is a molecular compound, and you also need to understand what a compound is. A compound is when you have elements combining chemically. Okay, we get a compound when we have elements combining chemically through, of course, bonds. Okay, so what we are emphasizing here, the one unique concept that we are emphasizing is that we start with atoms. These atoms are of the same kind in an element, and we have several types of elements. And then we are saying that when you have these elements combining chemically, you can form what you call compounds. And you have bonds between these different atoms of either the same element or the different elements. Now, what you get usually is the properties of what you get out of what the constituents of what makes up, let us say, a compound. They're usually different. Okay, so we know that, for example, water is a molecular compound. We know that it is made up of hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen have different properties. Now, when you form water from hydrogen and from hydrogen and oxygen, the water will be totally different from the hydrogen and the water. And that is what we term as emergent properties. Okay, so we start with atoms. The atoms, you can have elements, have several atoms, and then from there you can have compounds. All these are at chemical level. So the second level is what we call the cellular level. That means we're talking about cells. We already know that cells are the basic unit of life. You have organisms that only have one single cell, and this single cell carries out all the life processes of a living organism. Okay? And then we have organisms that are made up of several cells, and we term these organisms as multicellular organisms. Whether the organism is multicellular or unicellular, they have structures inside their cells that we call the organelles. These organelles have different functions that they actually perform. For example, the mitochondria is used for generation of energy. For example, in plants, you have the chloroplast that is used for capturing sunlight. These are examples of organelles. Okay? So inside the cell, you have different components, and some of these components are basically compounds inside the cell. Okay, so we are moving from looking at the chemical component, and now we are moving to the cellular level, and we are saying that inside the cells, you have different chemicals there. Okay, that's what we are at. Now, still the concept of emergent properties is actually here. What does this mean? That we have just said that inside the cell, you have different chemicals. Most of these are actually organic compounds or inorganic compounds. So you have salts, you have carbohydrates, you have carbohydrates, you have proteins, you have lipids. All these are inside the cell. But the cell does not behave like what makes it. Because inside we have these chemicals, but the properties of a cell are actually different. So we are also saying that cells exhibit what we call emergent properties. That what makes up something does not mean that the same properties will be exhibited when we look at that whole level. Okay, so emergent property in the cell is about the ability to carry out life processes. Life processes means the same as the characteristics of living organisms. That's what we mean. So cells can carry out these life processes: metabolism, excretion, and growth, a lot of these properties. Okay, respiration, and many others. But the things that make up the cell cannot carry out these processes. So where do these cells get the ability to carry out these processes related to what makes them don't have these properties? Okay, so that means that emergent properties of cells cannot only be understood by looking at the behavior of molecules in isolation. So the next level is what we call the tissue level. Here, we are looking at the different cells. We have groups of cells working together to perform a particular function. That's what we call tissues. So in humans, we have different tissues. We have, for example, the muscular tissue, we have connective tissue, nervous tissue, and then epidermal tissues. Okay? And then in plants, we can talk about, for example, the epidermis, and then also the vascular tissue, which contains the phloem and the xylem. Okay, so at tissue level, we are looking at an organism where you have different cells that are similar and can perform different functions. So you have different groups of cells that are similar and perform different functions. Okay, or I can repeat that you have an organism that has cells working together to accomplish particular functions, and this is at the tissue level. And then at the organ level, we look at the different groups of tissues that work together to perform a particular function. Okay, so we have, for example, the heart is used to pump blood, right? You have the lungs for gaseous exchange. You have the brain for processing information. You have the liver for metabolism. These are all examples of organs. They carry out specific functions. Now, these organs are made up of different tissues that work together. And then the organ system level. Now here we have different organs working together to accomplish a particular function again. So here, this is where we talk about the respiratory system, the circulatory system, the endocrine system, digestive system, all these. So we can look at, for example, the circulatory system. This one is about carrying blood from different parts of the body. That's the function. And it is made up of different organs. Okay? And then we come to the nervous system. This one is concerned with coordination or nervous coordination. It has the brain, the spinal cord, and the different nerves of the body. And then we have the endocrine system. This one is concerned with what we call hormonal coordination. And then we have the digestive system, concerned with digestion of food. And then we have the musculoskeletal system, concerned with movement. Okay, and coordination. Okay, so these are the different systems. And this, we look at the systems at the level of the organ system level. And now the whole organism, for example, a full human being has several systems. All these systems need to be working for the person to be healthy. Okay, still we have emergent properties that are beyond the organ system. That the person can carry out different activities, biological activities that cannot be explained by the sum of the different systems that the person is having, or that an organism is exhibiting. So, in this presentation, we have noted that we have different organisms. We have organisms that are made of a single cell, and we call them unicellular organisms. So, for cells, for organisms that are unicellular, that have only a single cell, do they have any advantage? The answer is yes. One is that unicellular organisms are very small, and the fact that they are very small, it enables them to actually be able to live in different habitats. Okay, that means that they actually don't need a lot of food, and they can depend on, let us say, diffusion to get what they want. For example, food or even gases, and they can also depend on diffusion to remove what they actually don't need in the cell. Okay, so that means that they don't need these complex structures that will require a lot of processes for maintaining. The challenge is that they are vulnerable to predation or to predators. The meaning of this is that they can easily be eaten. They cannot fight back. They cannot just look at it in terms of having a complex organism that has many cells. Some of these cells or tissues are used for defense, for example, but they don't have several of these cells that can perform, for example, functions associated to defense. So that means that the disadvantages of being unicellular can be the advantages of being multicellular. Okay, so one, Because now you have several cells, it means that these different cells can carry out different functions, okay, such that you have efficiency, such that you can respond to danger immediately, such that if one cell is damaged, you can replace it with another cell by cell division. That means that you can carry out different processes that can allow you to be able to survive and also to maintain a constant internal environment. Okay, that also means that you can actually fight back if you have you're faced with you're faced. That is, if there is a predator coming, it means that you can be able to respond to avoid the predator, or even you can actually be able to capture the prey because you have all the systems. You have the muscular system that can help in grabbing the prey, or if it is about running, you can run away from the predator and things like that. The challenge is that means that the multicellular organism needs to eat enough food. Okay, so they require a large amount of food to be able to sustain all these cells. Okay, they also require specialized systems, specialized locomotory systems for structures, specialized system for gaseous systems, specialized system for transport, specialized system for excretion. All these are needed because they cannot rely on the diffusion. These multicellular organisms do not rely on diffusion to get what they want and also to remove what they don't want. The diffusion cannot happen. So that's why it is very important to have those systems. So complex system for gaseous exchange, complex system for exchange for removal of waste material, complex system for transport of materials within the organism. So we have so far looked at organisms, individual organisms. We have looked at individual organisms that only have one cell. We have looked at individual organisms that have very many cells. For example, for us, the humans or even the tree, or even any other animal, they have several cells, and it is individual organisms that you are looking at. Now we can look at the interaction of organisms with others. So we can look at the first level for this kind of interaction. The first level of that interaction is what we call a population. When you have organisms of the same species occupying the same geographical area, that is what we call a population. So the same species, same geographical area, that is a population. That you can have different organisms of different species being in a particular geographical area, that one forms what we call a community. And now we move to what we call an ecosystem. An ecosystem, you have, at this level, you have a community. Remember, the community, different populations form the community. You have different organisms of different species occupying a particular area. That's what we call a community. Now, in an ecosystem, you are looking at the community together with the non-living component of the environment. Okay, so for example, in the image, you can see that there is water, we have plants there, right? And then you also have mountains. The whole, whatever you see there is an ecosystem. Okay, we have aquatic ecosystem, the organisms that are within the water, and then how they interact with the water and the rocks and the things in below the water. That is a whole aquatic system. And then you have what happens on land ecosystems, on the slopes or on the tops of mountains. These are all different ecosystems. So what we are basically saying here is that We can also be looking at organisms at a level where they exist as groups and how they interact with the environment. So in this case, you can look at groups in terms of population, groups in terms of communities. But when we talk about ecosystems, we're looking at organisms generally and how they interact with the non-living environment. Okay? And then the biosphere. Now, that level of the biosphere, looking at the component of the earth where we have life. Okay? Where we have life. That is what we call biosphere. Biosphere. Bio means life. Where there is life is what we call biosphere. The Earth's inhabited areas are the ones we call the biosphere. So the biosphere has many categorization. We have the atmosphere, that space. We have the hydrosphere, the water. Then we have the lithosphere, that is the Earth's crust, right? Yes, we also have organisms there. Okay, we have life there. So the study of organisms and their interaction with each other and the environment is what we call ecology. So we study ecosystems and ecology. So we go back to our scenario where we looked at the mold. In the mold, you have termites. These termites are organized at different levels. The termites individually are made up of cells. Some of these cells actually perform different functions. We have cells that are digestive. You have cells that are nervous. That means they're important in coordination. These cells have small structures that are called the organelles. For example, the mitochondria that perform particular functions related to energy production. So that is the level, the cellular level that we see in our scenario. Okay, so in that scenario of the mold, you have the cellular level. Okay, you have the organism level, and then you have the population level. Okay, so we go to the organism level. Now, the individual termite itself, that's what we are looking at. So this individual termite has organ systems such as the digestive system for processing food, and then the nervous system for processing information. Okay, so these systems come as a result of collaboration of the cells that make up the termite. Okay, and then at the population level, we already saw that these termites actually work in groups and they perform different functions. And that therefore means that if there is any problem that happens to individual termites, then the whole population may actually be affected, because at the population level, we are looking at organisms of the same species living in a particular geographical area. So the termites in that mold are actually a population. Okay, so the fact that they work together is very vital for their own survival, because they carry out different functions. We have soldiers, we have workers, we have the queen that do different roles, that perform different roles. Okay, so question 2 is very important for us to understand, because it wants us to explain how the interaction between organisms at one level might contribute to the function of a higher level. If the cells don't work, for example, it means that even the organ will not work, even the organ system will not work, and even the organism will not actually also be okay or be healthy. That is what this is all about. Okay, so at cellular level, for example, in the termites, you have specialized digestive cells in the termite's gut. These digestive cells can be able to work if what is inside the cells, for example, the mitochondria, can produce the energy that the cells can use to carry out the different functions. So you see that what is inside the organelles are very important in contributing to the working of the cell. Now, when we come to to using that example of the food. So you have digestive cells. These cells can be supported by the mitochondria that help in breaking down the food to such that the termite can have the energy to carry out different processes. Okay, so it means that these cells have to interact at that level. The cells, it's not only one cell working, all cells have to interact. Okay, the cells work in harmony to make sure that they can perform the different roles that are very important. Okay, and then we come to the organ system level. Now, if you have a working cell, it means the organism can be able to carry out other functions. Okay, so that's, for example, looking for food. The termite can be able to look for food. So we're talking about the termite at the level of the whole termite and go and look for food. Why? Because if that they don't look for the food, the other level at the mitochondria in the cell, they will not get the food that they will break down for the whole termite even to get energy. So that you see the linkage. So that means that if the cells are working properly, the whole termite can go and look for food and eat it, and then the cells can actually break down that food for the termite to get energy. Okay, and then also coming to the population level now. If the cells can carry out if the whole organism can carry out their functions well, it means the whole population will benefit. Why? Because we know that we have the workers, and then you have those that are soldiers, and then you have the queen. Okay, all these would also thrive if the different organisms, all the different individual termites can